William Walker Atkinson's The New Psychology, Its Message, Principles, and Practice. Chapter 14 was Desire, and this is Chapter 15, The Will. As we said in the last chapter, desire is connected with the will. One may desire much and often without exerting the will into action. But it is difficult to conceive of the will acting without desire, consciously or subconsciously exerted. One may want to do a thing and yet not do it. But it is almost impossible to conceive of one willing to do a thing unless under the motive of desire, either in the sense of want on the one side, or fear, repulsion, or aversion on the other. And so, at the last, will is seen to be the active expression of desire in some form. But this does not mean that one must act upon every desire, or that one does so. The experience of everyone informs him that desire may be restrained, restricted, or completely inhibited, and that the will, instead of responding to the urge of the desire, may refuse to do so, and even may act to restrain the desire and drive it from the mind. And so we approach the consideration of the will in its threefold aspect. On the one side, will is seen to blend into desire, so closely that it is difficult to distinguish the dividing line. Some hold that desire is but one of the phases of the will. The second phase of will is seen in the manifestation of that which we call choice, the ability to select and choose between objects of desire. In fact, to many, this is considered the principal function of the will. The dictionaries give us one of the fundamental meanings of the will, the act of determining, deciding, making choice, etc. Now, this making choice is a complex matter, involving the weighing of conflicting desires, weighing them by the light of reason, striking an average, and finally determining upon the choice. But this choice is determined largely by reason of the habit paths of the mind, for the reason that it is always the line of the least resistance to repeat an accustomed object in preference to a new and unaccustomed one. So, after all, the subconscious plays a most important part in the choice, not only by reason of the relative strength of the several desires presented to the will, but also by reason of the mental paths of the mind. The average person is governed almost altogether by the feelings and emotions in making choices of this kind. In using the will in this way, only those who have attained some degree of mental control are able to subject these conflicting desires to the bright light of the reason, and to determine accordingly. To do this requires the ability to detach the ego, in a measure, from the subconscious influences, and to allow it to dwell on the judicial bench of the reason, and to weigh and decide impartially according to the merits of the case. The man or woman who has attained this stage is well on the way toward self-mastery, or mental mastery, The majority of people do not think at all in these matters. They only think they think, and are in reality governed entirely by their feelings, emotions, desires, and fears, modified and directed by the suggestions of the outside world. The third phase of will is that of volition or action. In this phase, the latent power of desire is released, in accordance with the decision made as above stated. The strength of the action depends upon the force of the desire, or the necessity of the action, the latter being but another form of desire, as you will see if you consider the matter for a moment. There is a point of hesitation before desire springs into will action, the point of indecision, which occupies but a small fraction of a second of time. In fact, particularly among the lower and untrained examples of the race, the action is almost automatic and without rational consideration. Some desires never pass into the states of action, but are held back either by the power of conflicting desires or else from want of energy in the desire itself. But in this, as in other phases of mental action, the new psychology does not content itself with a mere discourse upon the nature and action of the will. It proceeds to inform one how the will may be trained and applied to the best advantage. The training of the will properly forms the subject of a separate volume, and one of the books of this series will be devoted to it, but a few general rules may be given here, as follows. Number 1. The recognition of the ego as master of the will. This recognition must be more than an abstract intellectual assent to the idea. It must consist of a conscious, intuitional feeling of the presence and reality of the I as the center of the mental field, and the master of the faculties, the feelings, the emotions, the desires, the imagination, the thoughts, the acts. The ego must turn its attention and interest inward toward itself, and contemplate itself in a manner possible to no other act of contemplation. It must inwardly cognize itself as the I, an actual living being or entity. To do this, the I must, for the moment and purpose, separate itself from the various instruments and attributes belonging to it. Excuse me. It must see and feel itself simply as the pure ego, the I am. It may take some time and practice in order to bring about this realization and the sense of power that comes with it, but the time and effort are well worthwhile, and every step of the process brings with it power and a consciousness of mastery. Read the chapter dealing with the ego and apply the principles and ideas contained therein. 2. Practice the control of the other portions of the mind by the will under the direction of the ego. Will to will. Then will you feel and desire and think and act according to the idea first formed. An idea that should be consistent with your highest ideals and according to your highest reason and clearest judgment. You feel a desire to do, or not to do a certain thing. Here is your chance to prove your will. Deliberately determine that you shall desire and feel the exact opposite of your present desire, and then proceed to manifest in action that idea and determination. The desire or feeling will struggle and rebel. It will fight for life and continuance, but you must oppose to it the deadly cold steel of your will, as directed by the pure ego. Persevere. Yield not an inch. Assert your mastery over our own mental domain, or over your own mental domain. Ask no quarter and give none. And as sure as tomorrow's sun will rise, so surely will your will triumph, for it is positive to the mental states when properly applied and persistently exerted. 3. Cultivate the faculty of deliberation and consideration. Excuse me again. In short, look before you leap. Test your feelings, emotions, impulses, and desires by the light of your reason. Test everything by the touchstone. Will this make me stronger? Does this make me more powerful? Does this tend toward attainment? Is this conducive to my highest good? This does not necessarily mean that you should be afraid to act and hesitate to make up your mind. No, deliberation is often accomplished in the twinkling of an eye. The thing is to be sure that you have deliberated, sure that you have turned the light of understanding upon the impulse, sure that you have subjected the mental state to the conscious scrutiny of the ego, instead of having merely acted from habit or impulse. Be sure you know what you want, and then do it. Be sure you're right, and then go ahead. Hold the wild horses of your chariot firmly in the hands of the ego, whose reins and guiding lines are the will. 4. Cultivate the attention. Cultivate the attention until you can focus it upon an object or idea with concentrated force. The attention determines the path of the will, either toward or away from the object of the attention, as the case may be. Attention is the eye of the ego, the chariot driver. 5. Acquire the habit of controlling yourself by your will. When you have once acquired this habit, half the battle will be over, for the rest of the mind will have learned to respond to the guiding line and reins. The wild horses of the mind will have learned the effect of control and will interpose a constantly decreasing resistance. Don't allow your mental horses to run away with the chariot. These mental steeds will do wonderful work when controlled, but if allowed to pull along unrestrained and heedless of the hand of the master, will run you into mire and morass, and may wreck the chariot and throw the charioteer into the ditch or over the precipice. 6. Train the mental steeds by driving them in directions contrary to those they may want to follow. This not because their way is necessarily wrong in such cases, but because you wish to train them to the use of the rein and curb, to accustom them to your mastery. One of the best ways to administer this kind of training is deliberately to make yourself perform some disagreeable task, something that you do not wish to do, or do not feel like doing. Here you will have a fight worthy of your mettle. The rebellious feelings and desires will rear and plunge and use every art and wile to defeat your purpose. Finding that you are determined to rule, they may even seemingly acquiesce, only to take you by surprise and off your guard when you relax your efforts and believe that you have conquered. They sometimes act like Josh Billings' mule, who stayed a good 3 months in order to get a chance to kick the man. Desires and feelings are wily animals. Excuse me again. Watch them, and do not be caught napping off or off your guard. By doing disagreeable things once in a while, doing something that you do not feel like doing, and leaving undone something that you feel very much like doing, you will gain a control that will serve you well in some hour of need when you will require all of your willpower in order to act right. The whole secret is teaching the desires the habit of being controlled by the will. Many great men have known this law and have employed it advantageously. One writer mentions the case of a man who was found reading a dry book on political economy. His friend expressing surprise, he replied, "I am doing this because I dislike it." He was training his mental horses. One of the best and simplest methods of putting this rule into effect is to heed the popular adage, "Do it now." Procrastination is a particularly bulky horse. These several rules may appear very simple. So simple that many of you will be inclined to shrug your shoulders and murmur, platitudes they may be. But have you ever tried to practice them? This is the best test of the real value. Practice and actual trial. We say to you positively, and with all the earnestness at our command, if you will but put them into actual practice for a single month, you will thank us over and over again for suggesting them to you, for you will find yourself a new man or woman, with new and greater powers than you have ever dreamed of possessing, and you will have opened up to yourself not only wonderful paths of power, but also wonderful paths of pleasure, for there is no enjoyment equal to that of the master who has learned to attain, accomplish, and surmount natural obstacles. The joy of the victor in such a conflict more than repays him for his struggle. The man who masters himself is well on his way to master the things outside. The one who masters himself has grasped the key of power. In conclusion, we ask you to read these words of Halleck, which bear directly upon this phase of the subject. It is the function of a well-trained will to adhere to a given line of conduct or ideas until they have become an integral part of the self. Only those ideas which are so absorbed become valuable elements of the character. We are coins, the metal of which has been dug from the minds of our inborn intellectual and moral faculties by willpower. If we properly work these minds, we may find metal enough in us to justify a stamp of a very high value. On the other hand, though there is much unmined metal beneath the surface, we often form a character marked with a penny stamp. It may be true that circumstances stamp us to a certain extent, but it is also true that the way in which we use them stamps us indelibly. Do not remain the slave of circumstances, feelings, emotions, or desires, but assert yourself, your real self, the ego, you. Chapter 16 will be thinking, conscious and subconscious.